Welcome. Welcome to this new episode of the Dynamic Antitrust Conversation series in partnership with Competition Policy International. During those series, we discuss a number of topics that can be timely and come from the news. And today's topic cannot be more timely. We're going to talk about transatlantic antitrust and the relationship between these two large antitrust jurisdictions, which is the US and the EU jurisdictions. Today, this week has been very, very busy in terms of antitrust, where we've seen a number of developments and where the international aspect of antitrust and the transatlantic relationship between antitrust agencies may have developed or kicked off in a new partnership, in a new dialogue. So I'm more than delighted to have this conversation today with two international experts, well-known and renowned because of their work, their speak, and their publications in that field. So I'm delighted to welcome Professor Eleanor Fox. Professor Eleanor Fox is Walter de Remberg Professor of Trade Regulation. Eleanor has written extensively on antitrust, international antitrust, and especially perhaps on transatlantic antitrust, this relationship between EU and US. And I'm more than delighted to welcome also Maria Coppola from the Federal Trade Commission. Maria is counsel for international antitrust at the US Federal Trade Commission, and she's also adjunct professor at George Mason University Law School, teaching European competition law. So what is this, where are we in terms of the relationship between antitrust agencies between the US and EU? Well, this discussion has been very interesting for the last 20 or 30 years in terms of divergence and convergence, and where do we stand now? These are the questions I would like to start with. Perhaps give us an historical background of what has been the diverging trends or converging trends between US antitrust laws and EU competition laws. So perhaps, Eleanor, do you want to perhaps give us an overview of this relationship between these antitrust enforcement?
Yes, thank you. And so nice to be here. Thank you very much. So what is the relationship between US and EU competition law? And then you also asked what is the relationship between the agencies enforcing the competition law, which are actually two different questions at different times. So let me say a word first about the relationship of the laws themselves to show where there are some divergences. And of course, there are lots of convergences, and they're both competition laws. So you would expect a lot of convergences. So I'll say a couple of things why and how each system actually marches to a slightly different drummer, which may mean that the systems are along some different trend lines, but always in lots of ways tending to converge. So these are the different drummers. And I'm going to say a word about US today as law, but before any legislation, because as everyone knows, there's really dynamic legislation pending. And today, US antitrust law, as construed by our Supreme Court, is pretty conservative, and I would say neoliberal, and has a position to keep government out, even antitrust enforcement out. And when you're in the area of dominant firms, that single firm conduct, this is especially clear. Let the firm, to a very large extent, do what it wants, and an assumption that if it's allowed to do what it wants, there will be the most innovation and the most responsiveness to the market, even because companies want to get people to buy their products and services. So that's US. EU actually is different in that regard. It's far from being neoliberal, and the very blueprint of EU being common market, trying to get level playing field, has a stronger view of keeping the market open so that firms without power are able to contest the market.
Right.
So, and as you yourself have said, Aurelien, in some of your writing, the EU has a precautionary principle. So precautionary against abuses of power. And while US, before any amendments, has almost the opposite, a laissez-faire principle.
Right.
This could go in pretty different directions. Even despite this, we're pretty close on a huge number of issues today. And I'll just conclude this by saying, if you look at the rhetoric in the United States today, with the legislation, with the new administration, with the new appointments in the new administration, you see a thread of the US law that's much more like the EU law, much more precautionary principle, much more worried about the power of very large firms. So we have to wait and see what's going to happen in our legislation to see if there is really going to be the convergence. And just a word about the agencies. Even though the top courts of these two jurisdictions are different, have a different trend line, the agencies themselves over the years even have been much more sympathetic to one another. So you see much more sympathy and convergence at the agency level, what they're talking about, how they're analyzing, and especially so now.
Right, great. That's very interesting to also look at the different approach, different culture. Maria, what is your take on this perhaps historical development?
Yeah, I mean,
because, yeah.
I agree with everything that Eleanor said, but I would probably emphasize the convergence piece a little bit more. You know, certainly outside of single firm conduct, if you look at the cases that the US and the EC have done in parallel, they are almost unequivocally in the horizontal merger space, very much the same. In the non-horizontal space, largely the same. I guess some, you know, I'd separate conglomerate mergers in the EU on that front and some of the remedies in the vertical mergers. But if you look, for example, at reverse payments, at pay for delay, I mean, that was definitely an initiative that the US and the EC engaged in very much together. And what was really interesting is to see what happened to the market as a result of two agencies, and I should also say the Korean Fair Trade Commission, really going after the same type of conduct. You saw a massive change in the industry behavior. That's just a side note, probably a preface for later on when we talk about how joined up can these agencies be. But I think even in the area of single firm conduct, I think if you now, as Eleanor said, the courts control a lot. So if you look at the FTC's Qualcomm case, which we lost, you know, that case went much further than the European case did. Right. It was much more interventionist or bold. If you look at DOJ's current Google case, it is almost identical to the Android case. I mean, probably DOJ would disagree with me, but I was shocked reading the complaint how similar it was to DOJ's Android case. And yeah, that goes for Intel, which the FTC and the EC did. So yeah, I think there's been a lot of headline cases where there are differences, like Google Shopping, for example, but it doesn't mean that things are largely different. It means they're different at the margins.
That's right. That's very interesting to single out perhaps the single firm conduct as perhaps the area where we can see some divergence, but in other issues of cartel or merger, there's a lot of convergence over the years. And you just referred to the Google cases. That's true that sometimes the US can be more stringent in the sense like they call for structural remedies at the end of the day. So that can be more aggressive to some extent when these are not what was thought of in the EU, where behavioral remedies or fines were at least preferred. So that's a very interesting development. But of course, these developments have unfolded even more in the last couple of weeks or couple of months. I think about the European side, where we have these Digital Markets Act proposals that will aim at regulating or at least revamping the regulation of digital competition. And so we had these digital market acts that created a lot of discussions already. And we saw last Friday these US antitrust bills it's a package proposed by Representative Sicily, and I think this is very striking for the discussion today, transatlantic antitrust, to see that this notion of gatekeepers in EU, or what they call critical trading partners in the US, is very much similar, and we may see very much converging approach to the way tech is regulated. So, perhaps, Eleanor, do you want to have this view on what can we say in terms of comparison of the DMA with the lastly announced US antitrust bills?
Yes, so first I want to say, be cautious when you're talking about legislation. I would not say this is convergence at all. These are bills. They are important bills. They are only bills. They've now been launched. They're launched for a big discussion. So I wouldn't call that convergence. I also wouldn't call convergence the fact that in the Google complaint it says we would like any relief appropriate, including structural. We will see. That doesn't mean very much. In terms of the bills, the bills are really dramatic. For the House of Representatives Judiciary Antitrust Subcommittee bills, because they're now going to the full Judiciary Committee for markup, and we'll see how they are received. But they would hit virtually every, let's say, nerve that is a complaint against big tech. So what you're calling convergence, let me say a word about this, playing on your playbook right now. There is an idea out there, and it's certainly an idea out there in the US, that the big tech firms are way too big with too much power and they ought to be reined in, and that our current competition laws are not sufficient to rein them in for a few reasons, very basic reasons on how you analyze what's an antitrust violation. These are unilateral conduct violations. If you're in the United States, you have to prove first that the firm is in a monopoly position. Each one of the big GAFA companies makes a strong claim, of course, rhetorically, saying, I'm not a monopolist. The competition's a click away. That's what Google says always, but it has more than a germ of truth. And they always say, too, look at all the things we give to consumers at zero price. Look at all everybody has gotten that they haven't gotten before. So you have, on the one hand, law in the US that's somewhat sympathetic to that position. And then you have this huge rhetoric or more wave, and more, it is more. Huge rhetoric wave, which is carried out, and it's associated with populism often, carried out in our legislature, carried out in the new appointments of Tim Wu and Lena Khan, to say we've really got to push back on that neoliberal US point of view, because otherwise we're not going to be able to rein in big tech at all. So from the point of view, this is in the United States, and a point you made, it seeking structural relief. This point of view of powerful transformational reining in could involve breakups, and would be a transformation of our law. Then there are much more, then there are middle grounds. I mean, Neo-Brandeis is just one strong point along the continuum, but there's a very strong point along the continuum that gets lost. But I think the FTC is there, actually. It's not Neo-Brandeis. It's not saying open analysis to everything, including whether workers are hurt. But it is saying our laws are too narrow and need to be made more robust in usual market paradigms. You don't have to call it consumer welfare. You can call it a market paradigm, but it's the market paradigm. And so we have this strong, I'll say, middle in the United States. And my expectation is that somewhere in there, the middle will prevail in the United States.
Right. That's very interesting, because we may think of bills as legislation. You're very right that this is not legislation. It's rhetoric, and we'll see how it ends up being. But yeah, the populist Neo-Brandeisians may have clearly prevail in the sense that, yeah, this is a more very extreme part, and we may hope for a moderate, as you just called for, a moderate solution to be adopted. Maria, I just wanted
to say that sometimes you need an extreme right or left to get movement to end up in the middle, and from that point of view, even for those who are not Neo-Brandeisian, that can be a big help.
It definitely triggers antitrust debates. I mean, antitrust is becoming sexy again, as it has been written. So, Maya, I just wanted to have precisely your viewpoint on this comparison between the DMA, your antitrust, but also the UK proposals. I think there's some development here which are interesting.
Yeah, so I should have noted at the outset, by the way, that my remarks today are my own. So I'm actually in the UK right now. I am housed within the Competition and Markets Authority, and I have spent the entire week explaining how a bill becomes a law. I even actually at some point brought up the Schoolhouse Rock song, and explaining what it means to introduce a bill versus signing a final bill, because there is very much this idea of, wow, this is amazing. In many ways, this goes further than the proposed DMA. Certainly the types of conduct involved go further. The definitions are very similar and possibly have the same challenges and difficulties associated with them. It was really interesting to me in reading the platform bill, Cicilline's, sort of the most comprehensive bill, that there is a lot more room for business justifications and efficiencies than there is in the DMA. And the DMA may change. It is a proposal also. But I did think that was funny that, yes, it goes further. Yes, it stops more conduct, but there still is in it that basic fundamental idea of you can have a business justification for this conduct.
That may be the rule of reason. There's some rule of reason that still prevail, right?
It brings in a bit. Yeah. I think it's probably more like truncated, if anything, because the language in other parts is very clear, but at least the possibility is there. Look, it's been very interesting to watch what's happening. If you look at the hearings that led up to the Judiciary Committee report that Senator Klobuchar has had, that Cicilline's had, they are bringing in European experts all the time. Right. It's just stunning how many people are looking to Europe right now in thinking about how to reform the US. I do think that there's an awful lot of attention on Brussels. I think there should be a little bit more attention maybe on what the UK is doing. In many ways, it's a more flexible instrument, and it looks more like US-style regulation. So it is more principles-based. It involves, codes of conduct, things that are much more familiar in the US landscape. So it'll be interesting to see if, as the bills move along, if they don't move a little bit more towards the UK, what the UK has proposed. The other thing I'll note is that what the UK and the US have in common, and it's lacking in the DMA, is to address the challenge of mergers. The difficulty that agencies have in challenging mergers, in particular these tech mergers, where there's a lot of predicting the future. There's a lot of challenges for agencies to really understand these markets in a way that the businesses do. And so it's interesting to see that the US, including the comprehensive bills like CLARA, but also the tech specific, and the UK, both have proposals for merger reform that's not in the DMA. There may be other reasons for that, because it may be that it needs to be done under a different treaty article, but I did think that was interesting.
That is very interesting.
Could I jump in with one more thought, which is, because I really didn't address your question about comparison between US and DMA. DMA is much more regulatory, and as Maria said, more regulatory also than the CMA's proposal. And I do believe that DMA is going to get adopted. It has to go through Parliament. It does have to go through a couple of steps.
Oh, you're muted.
You're muted.
You must have touched a button.
Oh,
there you go. Good.
Okay. Chances of DMA getting adopted are very, very high compared with the great uncertainty of what comes through in the US. And what we'll probably end up with, because what EU adopts is going to be Brussels effect.
Yeah.
And what EU adopts, it's going to overwhelm us. I mean, it's going to, in a way, override us if the companies find that they can't have two ways of doing things efficiently. That is, they have to abide by the EU rules. And if they have to abide by the EU rules, they might decide that's they will do business all over the world that way. It will become a very regulatory system that's inconsistent with the US notion of more case-based and more conceptual-based and more, as Maria pointed out, room for the companies to come forward and say, look, I want to tell you exactly why I'm doing this, and it's proportional for good business reasons that fit what consumers need.
Yeah, that's very interesting to have this, the DMA as the de facto regulatory standard, because that's what it would become. We saw that with the GDPR, right?
Right.
And I think very similar effect will happen with the DMA, because no matter how those bills in the US will go, if they are adopted or not, but I think the DMA's chance of being adopted is close to 100%. So I think there's a high chance that the DMA will be the world standard for regulating digital competition.
I mean, even if firms can adapt, because I think different firms that are under scrutiny have different business models, and some may be more able to to cut off circle markets and others may need to change at a more global level. But I think that, irrespective, there's probably going to be something in the US, there's probably going to be something in the UK, there's probably going to be something in Brussels. And I hope very much that really clear and conscious thought will be given to how the systems interoperate. I was speaking with Eleanor yesterday, and I said, dear God, I hope we have learned something from the massive adoption of merger control in the 1990s. And the systems were very inconsistent, conflicting, overlapping. And there is really a need to think long and hard, not to repeat that mistake, recognizing that competition agencies' remit is domestic, but that these firms are global and they need to be able to operate across jurisdictions. So I hope we've learned something from the merger experience that took 20 years maybe to fix, that we can do that a little more at the front end this time.
Yeah, that's very interesting. We need to learn from experience and more global and dynamic approach to this issue. I think at least with the DMA and what the bills at least signal is that this willingness to regulate gatekeepers or critical trading partners as different than the rest of the economy, and that's, I think, what's quite new, right? This kind of threshold effect where you have some rules for some companies and other rules for other companies. That is a great large paradigm shift from antitrust enforcement as we used to know it until now. Do you want to react? No?
So, yes, I would like to react and maybe push back.
Yes. Okay,
also,
good. I was going to do that.
Also, I wanted to say a word for both the EU and the UK and Germany, so that this didn't get lost. Let me say this word, that we owe a lot to European Union for being out in front on this issue. We owe a lot to the German Bundeskartellamt for being way out in front on this set of issues. While US was saying, no problem here, these are just competitive firms doing great things. Germany was on top of the big data problem since at least 5 or 6 years ago. and talking about, I mean, the network effects, the data, the appropriation of data by the big tech, and using it and selling it, and sometimes a little deception or loss of control of our own data. And I think Germany and EU deserve a lot of credit for recognizing problems that most people would say are abuses of dominance and might not fit into the usual paradigm. So, all right, I wanted to say that so that didn't get lost, because I think that's really a big contribution. And then going to the issue that you're on right now, which is on global and the different angles on which the various nations approach the problem. Maria is absolutely right that I hope we have learned from the merger lessons on convergence, speaking together, collaborating together. We've got to do more collaboration. I'm not sure what it's going to lead to. We don't have, and we're not going to get an international law, much less an international law of GAFA, which is one thing you're pointing out, Aurelien. Do we really want to focus on these few companies, or should we have a very general principle? So I want to say two things. One goes directly to, is it legitimate or not to have legislation that's really focused on a handful of companies, even though the legislation doesn't necessarily do that, but the rhetoric behind it does. That is, it's focused on GAFA plus one or two or three or four. Do we want to do that? And the second point relates to the world system. These companies are like the big tech companies. They are like little governments. They do business across the world. They're trying to do business as they like without regard to, the interests of both the countries and the consumers. There needs to be an overall concept. There has to be, even in absence of international law, there has to be some reference to thinking about what's good for the world in terms of controlling or regulating this power. And on the one hand, if there weren't all other things that prevent all other things from being equal, we would say this is the kind of thing where you really need codes, rules, norms for the world. But you can't get there easily. And I was talking to Maria about this, and Maria has some really good ideas about this, of how to bring people together and how to try to develop those norms, which, let's say, at the top, that everybody really buys into. You might have to generalize a little bit, but norms that everybody buys into. And just to close this statement, I think actually in this particular case, it is justified to focus on the handful of big tech, because that's exactly where we are seeing these new forms of power, new forms of global business that need to be anchored down, and new forms of abuse. And if we do focus, as EU is trying to, Germany, UK, maybe US, if we do focus on what is the problem, are these like little governments that put a platform out there and say, you can compete on this, but if I don't like your competition because it threatens me, I'll cut you off at the knees. I mean, this is what the world would say is unfair, and it's not always what antitrust technicians will say is anti-competitive. So we need norms meet for that occasion.
Maria?
Yeah, I'm not going to get into some of my ideas I share with Eleanor. I probably different form for that. But I was going to say that, I mean, I want to push back a little bit on the idea, first of all, that it's just GAFA. I think Ben Thompson has come up with, what companies would fall under the definition of covered platform as is. And there's a heck of a lot that if the market continues to grow, will be captured under that legislation very soon. So, the $600 billion threshold is there's a lot of firms that are just below that. The second is, I don't think it's the first time that globally, we've looked at a sector and said we need regulation. I think if you look at banking, it may have involved more firms, but definitely look at what Basel has been able to accomplish. And that could be an interesting role model actually for tech. There was a recognition of the need for interoperability, that there were similar problems happening across countries, and that the economies were linked enough that there were going to be effects in other jurisdictions and the need to work together. And out of that came Basel. So, and banking is just one example of where I think you do have governments at the same time getting together and separately regulating tech. Yeah. But I mean, it's a sector, but doing it also in a way that's coordinated, and that was through Basel.
That's a great transition to the next point of collaborations and coordination between governments. And it's exactly what we've kind of seen, or at least heard this week during the G7. President Biden and the EU have kind of worked on this transatlantic partnership, and within this transatlantic partnership, which cover a wealth of issues, there is this announcement for a US-EU joint technology competition policy dialogue. I mean, this is quite new, quite novel, and can be promising, because of course we need better coordination, better working together on this digital competition specifically. Of course, we don't know much about it because a few public information.
It's new.
Yeah. So, do you want? Yeah, please, Maya.
No, I mean, look, in many ways, this mirrors things that are already happening at the agency to agency level. I mean, the US and the EC, the UK, Australia, a few other partners. I mean, we are regularly in contact on digital initiatives. I can't tell you the number of webinars we've had on the DMA that we'll have on these bills. So there already is a ton of engagement. I think what's different here is we're getting signals from the top that this is something that is really important. And as competition agencies, you can't do much by yourself. So having this senior level buy-in, these decision maker buy-in, is going to change probably the outcomes of those dialogues. I think if you left a bunch of competition agencies in a room together, they'd be able to solve problems, but they can't necessarily persuade others above them to do that. And I'll just note that similarly, the UK has the presidency of the G7 this year, and there's a big push for competition to be included in that. There's going to be a big event in September in London, and competition agencies are very much on the agenda, which is, of course, not been the case for many, many decades.
That's true. Eleanor, do you want to have a word on, or we can move perhaps to the next topic, which is again coordination between antitrust agencies, as we discussed in this working group on pharma mergers, right? We have also these working group on scrutinizing pharma mergers between, I think, the FTC, DOJ, UK, and EU antitrust agencies. And I mean, I was wondering, I would like to ask you, Eleanor, is it a good thing, and is it rational perhaps to limit it only to pharma mergers and not perhaps to every mergers? What do you think about this ad hoc coordination on the specific topic?
Yes, so I think it's useful, and there can be progress. Maria said a lot of things before about mergers. The countries are pretty much on the same page, and so it probably will result in just more talking to each other, more in depth on maybe even particular pharma mergers. That's good. Pharma has been a problem area with extraordinarily high prices and a huge number of mergers. But as you and I spoke, Aurelien, I do think this is really segueing to a different merger problem. I think in mergers, there's a different problem from the one that we were talking about on tech. And the different problem is this: there are huge, apart from the nascent acquisitions and all that, which is covered in the legislation, the big problem is this: it's about mega mergers, and it's about very narrow sight of each country looking at a mega merger. It could be the huge cement merger, Holcim Lafarge, or Bayer Monsanto, or the big beer mergers. each country is looking at the merger with a view to its own consumers, and properly so, but not looking at the world and its impacts. And you have a big, huge merger like Bayer Monsanto. Everybody agreed, lots of anti-competitive aspects. And each country does the spin-offs it says is good for it. And what it does is it lets the merger through. There are almost no prohibitions of mega mergers, and puts the burden on a lot of developing countries who are the ones that are really harmed most and least able to take care for themselves of the anti-competitive effects. And so I think on mergers, we have to look forward to a kind of collaboration where each of the parties, which would be agencies of affected countries, is having regard not only to their own markets, but thinking about the world picture, taking it all into account, going home and enjoying it if it has huge anti-competitive effects, not being so shy to enjoy the mega mergers.
Yeah, so that there's a need again for principles with common approach internationally and all kinds of mergers, and perhaps not only firmer mergers but other mergers. Elena, I want to say with you on another topic, which is not very related with mergers, but we also see this perhaps growing convergence. I mean, it's still rhetoric, of course, because it's still a bill with respect to the New York antitrust bill, where we see some language, so rhetoric that is very explicitly borrowed from the European language. And I directly refer to the notion not of monopolization, as we know it in US antitrust laws, but the notion of abuse of dominant position, which is in itself a European notion. So what do you think about these bar and these perhaps use of rhetoric from both sides of the world, both sides of the Atlantic, where this can look some converging trends?
Yes, this is really interesting. So the background is all of the states of the United States have competition laws, and almost all of them look like a little Sherman Act. And New York does not have and has never had a unilateral conduct provision. It hasn't had any counterpart to Section 2 of the Sherman Act. So now it's finally, looks like it's getting ready to adopt its unilateral conduct provision. And it's in a world, a country in which the Section 2 of the Sherman Act is too narrow. It does not catch all anti-competitive conduct. It's perfectly normal for the US authorities and experts to say, we want to be modern. We don't want to be as narrow as the Supreme Court. We want to catch the anti-competitive conduct and not be neoliberal. So it's perfectly natural for it to want a standard that's broader than Section 2. And so what do? I think it's also perfectly natural to say adopt the language of abuse of dominance, because the language of Section 2 might not even cover big tech. So, of course, there's a huge controversy. There are a lot of people in the United States that say, oh, no, we don't like the European law. The litany is usually it's protecting competitors from competition. It doesn't have to. Europe is trying to keep open pathways for competition on the merits, but there is this strong pushback on saying we're really very worried. Look what New York is doing. It's sinking down to EU level of protecting competitors. And we'll see how this pans out. But I think New York will get a law that is a unilateral conduct law. And I would not be surprised if it does adopt the standard of abuse of dominance.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so you're more optimistic of the chance of the New York to pass its own bills than the Congress perhaps to pass its own bill. So we'll see, of course.
Yes.
But that's interesting.
We'll see.
That's very interesting. Perhaps, so we've talked about these transatlantic discussions and how we need collaborations and regulating big tech. But there's one question precisely from the audience, because we're moving now to the Q&A for the last 5 minutes. There's one question which is very relevant. It's like, what about China? There's an elephant in the room, which is China. Maria, do you want to have a say about those rules, how they will apply to China?
I mean, I think that Eleanor is going to be in a better position than I to answer, but I mean, if you look at what's happened in many of the tech areas, is China's sort of walled off, right? They don't, the role of the operating system doesn't have the same importance there. A lot of companies have been willing to create China-specific rules. So, the reach of all these laws is going to be domestic. The question is whether the companies are going to implement them on a worldwide basis. I think if you took a snapshot of today, you would see that they seem to be able to have a different set of rules in China and be able to keep that while still having the rest of the world the same business model and roughly the same rules.
Great.
So just to add to that, China is indeed the dragon in the room, and China is endlessly interesting. So in addition to what Maria said, it's interesting that China is doing a lot of aggressive work on big tech and has made big statements from the highest up to say we're really trying to tame our own big tech. And so they've
sometimes spectacular developments with
they brought a big suit against Alibaba, and it's on exclusionary practices. And again, it's somewhat similar to the EU Android, Google Android case and US case. And private actions have challenged the non-interoperability and non-access to data and preferencing. So in a way, they're on the same page, but as Maria said, they're in the walled garden so far. We'll see what happens, because China on big tech could possibly be poised for its companies to expand beyond China, but then still the wall keeping outsiders from getting in. And then China is also endlessly interesting on its use of industrial policy as and when it likes, and that's pretty unpredictable and makes it very frustrating for the West, which likes the Western rule of law and doesn't like non-transparent industrial policy.
Right, that's a real very important point to make about this the fairness of competition, because we talk at the end of the day competition on merits, and unfair competition can be distortion of competition where country may want to expand but may not let other companies to enter its own country. So that would be a two system models which may fraud the global level playing field. But what do you reply to those, perhaps Maria, to those who will say that all these rules about US tech rules and European tech rules will undermine the competitiveness of European or American tech companies as opposed to Chinese, perhaps? Is there an argument for competitiveness as part of the global competition framework?
I mean, I have great faith that we will not manage to kill innovation in the United States. There is nothing in our history that suggests that we will do that, and I don't think that's going to happen here. Just 1 second on the sort of general global coordination cooperation point. I mean, I do think that the selection of Lina Khan as chair of the FTC is going to have really important consequences for the US's ability to be welcome into the international dialogue at the highest levels. And I think that will allow a lot greater cooperation because there is this basic point of like-mindedness that's assumed when Chair Khan is the head of the FTC.
So I want to join both of those points. So first of all, the big tech companies, of course, they're going to say you're undermining our innovation. There's definitely control needed, whether it's antitrust or regulatory control that is needed to rein in abusive practices. There's no question about it. They have conflicts of interest. They do obstruct the free competition. And if the control and regulation is done right, it will only unleash innovation. It will unleash the innovation of the firms that have been pushed out and pushed back. And And then the second point I want to underscore too, and agree with Maria, with Lena Khan as head of the Federal Trade Commission, we're positioned to be really a good player in the international arena. And I think she'll be wonderfully accepted in the international arena as being foresightful and sufficiently aggressive and ruffling up feathers that ought to be ruffled up and play with the international team.
And on the innovation point, I will just add, I think that you should take a look at Philippe Aguillon's new book, Creative Destruction, which has a ton of empirical work that suggests that allowing incumbents to stay in power actually is going to hurt innovation in the long run. And so it does make you think about the consequences for tech, but I will stop there.
Yeah, well, I was on an event with Philippe Aguillon on Monday, so
okay,
yeah.
Great.
Yeah,
then you've heard the kind of, the book arrived today. I've had about half an hour to look at it, so I've got more to learn.
I had the French version from last year.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
But it's very important to look at competition from a dynamic perspective in the long run, and as it do dynamically, and not only from the static point of view, but the incentives, right? Are we destroying the incentives, or are we preserving the incentives? And I think that's very important. And that's it. That's very important for antitrust authorities to think about it, but also to cooperate more internationally and to harmonize to some extent to their approach, right? And that's what we need at the transatlantic level, but also at the global level, even if it's very hard to have. But principles of will help definitely. So I think it has been extremely interesting and very timely discussion. We're running out of time now. I think it's. I want to thank you, both of you, for providing us with this very incredibly interesting insight and also up to date, because there was a commentary about the news because of the freshness of the news. So thank you very much, both of us. It has been very interesting, and of course we're going to know more about this development, the transatlantic competition policy dialogue, and how these cases and proposals for relations will unfold. But thank you very much, both of you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Pleasure.